Hello and welcome. I am live from Pelham's Wasteland, and today I have another episode of Pelham's Wasteland Reads for you all. This time covering the rest of the Trader's Son cycle, which is a series of 5 books by the author Miles Cameron. And I did a video on the first book in this series, The Red Knight. But I thought I would do another video on basically the rest of the series. So if you haven't seen the first one on The Red Knight, which is the first book, go and check that one out. I suppose if you are interested, but if you're interested in some thoughts on kind of the rest of the series, then feel free to just watch this video. Yeah. So this is like I said, a 5-part fantasy series. Each one fairly long, seems like between kind of 600 and 800 pages as the norm. And each of them following a character, the titular Red Knight of the first book is our kind of core protagonist all the way through, although we have a number of other characters who, some of them as kind of smaller side characters and some of them as viewpoint characters in their own right at different times, who are either a part of the Red Knight's mercenary company or are other important characters in the world. Some of them, like for instance, the Queen of Alba gets a number of chapters of her own. And then the Red Knight's brother gets a number of chapters of his own, and some of these other characters that sort of fill out, I suppose, the kind of larger events of the world, especially as the series goes on, and the events of the larger world take up a greater and greater portion of the book. The first book is fairly tightly contained in a lot of ways. There are a number of different plot lines going on outside of sort of the main plot line, but they're all sort of brought together in the end into the one kind of final cohesive confrontation at the end of the first book, which is really cool. And the later books keep that sort of tradition alive of all of these kind of different disparate plot threads, although there's I think not really until basically the end of the 5th book, to some degree at the end of the 3rd book, there's a fairly major confrontation that brings a lot of the threads together. But in some ways, I think it's not really until the end of the 5th book that we have all of our plot threads kind of all the way back together again, and the kind of capstone of this whole series, which is fun. It's an interesting kind of stylistic blend of different things. You have some parts that feel very much like this kind of grand epic fantasy, and a lot of other parts that feel much more kind of like historical fiction, I guess, is the best comparison. I think so. Miles Cameron is also Christian Cameron. They're the same person, just writing under 2 different names: Miles for fantasy and Christian for historical fiction. And so it makes sense why a lot of the parts of the story would feel that kind of very, very grounded feel of good historical fiction, of kind of living in the world and having to deal with the reality of the things that these characters deal with. And I think that's really one of the real strengths of this series is I talked about it in the first book, but really the sense of being kind of grounded in the world and all sorts of very, very kind of real considerations, and the idea of like, well, armor works the way you would expect it to in fights, but then there's also there's a really good sense of like the political reality of this world. I think that characters are there are a number of kind of secondary characters who are devious without necessarily being cartoonishly evil, and I think there's a really good balance going on, and really a lot of the character writing in this series I think is really great. Cameron does a really good job of um, making these characters kind of convincing and interesting and fun to read about. In particular, our protagonist is, I think, has a really great um, kind of, for lack of a better term, there's a quote from one of the James Bond movies of "Never let him see you bleed," and that feels very much like how the Red Knight operates. That he is gets kind of beat up and isn't always as successful as he wants, and sometimes kind of oversteps himself and makes mistakes, but he's also he's cunning, and he's very clever, and he succeeds often enough because he is cunning and clever and believes in the kind of hard work of leadership, which I think is the other one of the other really outstanding parts of this series. Is that I think a lot of fantasy series um, present war and warfare in a way that is certainly entertaining to read about, but doesn't necessarily reflect kind of what actually, I guess, works in the real world, I guess is the way to put it. I think there are a lot of fantasy series where, like, you see battles won by kind of clever tricks or deceptions or things like that. And there are not very many fantasy series that do a really good job of essentially capitalizing on this idea that actually the way that you win battles is through a whole bunch of boring and tedious and uncomfortable and laborious things that happen before ever getting into the main fight. The idea of the sort of logistical side of warfare, and all of that as being a central part of the reality of winning battles. That in a lot of stories, I think, for a number of different reasons, that is not necessarily conveyed with nearly the depth that it is here. And I think that's a real strength of this series, like I said, is that there's a presentation of even the boring and slow parts of waging war are interesting because they are important, and they're interesting because the characters are involved and trying to succeed, and they understand the importance of things like having enough wagons to carry all of the food and extra gear, and having enough pack animals that are in good enough condition to pull the wagons, and all of the different things that are kind of the boring but necessary side of warfare, that are useful for winning battles, but are not necessarily always. I guess not to say that they aren't interesting, but they can seem uninteresting, and can seem like it's a difficult task to make them interesting for a reader to care about all that sort of stuff. But I think that is, like I said, one of the real main strengths of this series is how well that side of leadership and command in what is essentially medieval warfare with some fantasy elements, how all of that is conveyed is, I think, really central to why this particular series is so much fun. Um, so yeah, I'm not gonna. I decided that I wasn't gonna talk too much about what actually happens in this series, mostly because, like a lot of series, obviously the events of any given book become sort of the setup for the next book, and so I don't really want to spoil too much of anything. But I hope that I have, in sort of general terms, talked a bit about things that sound interesting. This idea of the sort of activity of warfare, and to be clear, in addition to the kind of the boring logistical side of warfare, the actual battles themselves are awesome in this series. They're so much fun. There's a great way that the kind of the movement of things and the sort of action at a number of different scales is really conveyed really well. This idea of, like, there's sort of action of an individual in individual combat, but there's also the larger action of formations in battle, and then the kind of total movement of armies as it relates to that. And I think that's really well done in this series, and really comes across in fun ways, and also capitalizes on something that I think this series does a remarkably good job of, which is that aside from there are a couple of, I guess you might say, main characters who seem uh, pretty much in control, not totally in control of their own destiny, but there's a sense that, while they won't die because they're sort of too important to the story, but there are a lot of minor characters in this series who are well realized and fun to read about, and are a character worth getting attached to, and then they get killed off in the space of like a sentence, and it really is, I think this is a real demonstration of the craft of writing large scale fantasy stories, that Cameron's able to create these is kind of secondary characters who are likable and believable and have their own kind of ambitions in life and all that sort of stuff. And then, because war is chaotic, they just die. And it's really good. I think even more so than I think about some of the other series that also do this. That I think the way that this Trader Sun Cycle series kind of handles that concept of character disposability is really, really well done. And so, yeah, that's another kind of strong point in favor of this one. So, anyway, if that sounds interesting to you, if this kind of medieval fantasy series with knights in plate armor, but also they fight wyverns and sometimes even dragons, and there's all sorts of kind of a blend of characters who are realistic and intelligent and have their own ambitions, and also um, I think does a cool thing of this series in particular, does a cool thing of a lot of the fantasy elements being tied into the less fantastical elements in really interesting ways. Like, I guess I'm going to do one kind of minor spoiler. There's a sequence in the second book where they are using basically magical lights to essentially create night vision for a set of scouts so that they can move the entire army up in the middle of darkness, which of course normally is really hard to do because nobody can see anything, because in humans don't have dark vision the way that other species in D&D like games might have dark vision, and therefore it wouldn't be as much of a deal. But for people, right, this is a real difficulty, and it's a really cool demonstration of kind of the payoff of these fantasy concepts being used in very, very interesting ways, to use magic to do things like to move troops around, or like to create a fog and a depression to hide an army or a section of an army, or all of these different things that are they feel very much like what again, kind of realistic and intelligent commanders would use these fantasy concepts for, in a way that still feels grounded. It still, it doesn't doesn't end up feeling the way that I think some fantasy series with the sort of there's a sort of gap between the fantasy side and the sort of military action side, and I think it works. That gap is really joined in this one in a way that feels really good. So yeah, I liked this series a lot. 5 books. I don't know if this might be the longest series that I've read this year. I guess depending on how you count the Scott Baker fantasy stuff. But yeah, very, very fun. Really a great kind of fun fantasy series that I liked a lot. So check out The Red Knight and the Fell Sword and the Dread Worm and A Plague of Swords and the Fall of Dragons, the Traitor Sun cycle by Miles Cameron. If you are interested in some fun late medieval military fantasy type stuff, it's cool. It's good. Anyway, that is, I guess, going to be it for me for today. If you have read the Trader Sun cycle, then you should leave a comment down below. I guess if you haven't read it, but you have a comment anyway, you should leave that down below as well. But otherwise, I've been live from Pelham's Wasteland, and I will see you next time. Take care, everybody.